and I am part of the public programs team for Campus. I'm the convener for that project. Campus is a series of talks. I'm part of an independent study program, and we're very pleased to welcome Céline Condorelli this evening. Céline's part of our faculty, a group of people exploring alternative modes of education, decolonial practice and post-colonial thinking.
Part of the public programs team for Campus.
And Céline will give an artist talk this evening about her practice and focus specifically around those current interests and preoccupations around notions of leisure and work. Through this timely examination and presenting historic case studies and her own fragmentary thinking on this topic, Céline will examine with us tonight her thoughts on leisure and culture activities in relation to how we view our free time, our working conditions, and the current preoccupation we have with being at work, which is particularly prescient at the moment because we're all socially distancing and very much apart from each other, and that's a strange concept to get our heads around in our own houses. So without further ado, I want to pass over now to Céline, and welcome to Campus. I'll just remind people that when Céline's finished her talk in about 40 minutes time, we'll be fielding questions through the live comment stream on YouTube. And just be aware that there'll be a kind of 40-minute delay for me to be able to read those, and we'll field as many as we can onto that. So without further ado, Céline, I'd like to pass over to you now.
Hi, Jenny. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks also to Sam and Nicole and everyone at Campus and Nottingham Contemporary for inviting me to do this lecture, and also for arranging a platform on which it could still be possible. So I spent a long time trying to figure out and think about the format of this talk, in parts due to the context. Of course, we're all staring at screens, so this is a different context that it's being delivered in that I have experience in. It's complicated for me to get my head around public speaking on this format, especially because public speaking has so much to do with presence. So making things present. Also, to be honest, in relationship to issues that I've been thinking about for a long time before the lockdown and the social distancing, whether or not to do artist talks and what that means in terms of a life in which you're traveling around the world all the time doing artist talks, which was anyway becoming impossible in relationship to, general and personal ecologies. And also finally as a way to integrate talks as part of my practice rather than something that was always outside it. So, and rather than something that is a description of things I've done, first I did this and then I did that, which is really very boring. So what I have for you today is of course fragmentary, and it's a process. I'm going to start by sharing my screen with a presentation that I prepared. So here it is, I think. There you go. So this is today, obviously today's date. So I've been thinking a lot about free time in these weeks, in these months, and in this year, this strange period that we're living through. That's just made it a main preoccupation. It's something that, perhaps I'm not occupied, I'm not working, but I am working, obviously. I spend so much time at home doing things that supposedly part of this freedom of time, which doesn't seem free at all. I'm not apparently working, I'm not apparently at work in the ways that I have understood my work until now. So the title of today's talk is The 2-Year Vacation. So the 2-Year Vacation is actually, it's a title of a novel that I picked up on holidays. I didn't read it. I was visiting some really dear friends in the Morvan in France. I found the book in this house in rural France. It's a novel by Jules Verne. of 1888, and apparently tells the fortune of a group of schoolboys who are stranded on an island somewhere in the ocean in the South Pacific, and it's about their struggles to overcome adversity. The title stuck, not the novel. Still haven't read it. It's kind of a shortcut, and it's been a shortcut since then. This was a long time, probably 10 years ago, for some kind of ideal pursuit. The idea that when I'm feeling overworked, I think about the 2-year vacation. It's quite a lot of the time that people feel overworked or used to feel overworked, right? So I decided to use the word vacation rather than holiday, which is what I normally use just because of its etymology. Vacation has a much nicer etymology. So it's from the Latin vacare, to be unoccupied in relationship to a space, to vacate. So the action of leaving something that one previously occupied, leaving the occupation, being post-occupied rather than preoccupied. And here's something about the kind of chairs that I imagine in my vacation: a deck chair or a lounger, a couch, in German a Liege. So this is Eileen Gray's lounger. It's called transatlantic, fauteuil transatlantic, so transatlantic lounger, which was of course inspired by the reclining chairs or used on the decks of ocean liners. Obviously, the transatlantic was named after the great vessels that crossed the ocean. The chair evokes long journeys at sea and this time spent meditating, contemplating the horizon as it unfolds. But it also refers to the relaxing spaces that we understand outside work, like the space of leisure. This chair was actually made in 1927 for her house at Cap Martin that she built, called, very famous house, I'm sure many of you know it, called E1027, in the south of France, overlooking the sea, really close to Monaco. So what you see in the back is actually the balustrade of her balcony. There's a really, really beautiful view on a bay on the other side of that. The liner deck chairs were, of course, reinterpreted many times throughout the 20th century and became common examples that you see in gardens and parks or on the beach all the time, in spaces both public and private. Or, of course, they were also, they inspired the common deck chair that is now associated with leisure, but also the chaise longue, or the reclining chair, which since the 19th century is present in clinics, in medical context, to overcome pulmonary diseases. So, for example, the first deck chairs were used in clinics in the mountains of Switzerland to overcome for the treatment of pulmonary tuberculosis, a disease for which doctors recommended reclining in fresh air and sunlight. So the deck chair is somehow a chair designed for recovering from work as well as from illness, and reflects like these two crucial modern concerns, leisure and health. The lounger became a 20th century design classic. This chair became an incredibly expensive 20th century classic, as I believe one of the most expensive chairs to ever be sold at auction. Culture and leisure have in the last 2 centuries become totally intertwined, so that it is impossible perhaps today to imagine and enjoy culture outside a time freed from work. The genesis of the labor movement as a political subject occurred in the course of the struggle for free time, right? Which corresponds today to something quite different to how it was meant today. Free time, Freizeit, tempo libero, temps libre. It kind of exists in all lots of different languages. However, I know that visiting a museum, seeing an exhibition, encountering art happens in these hours that count as free, within a time space that is a norm, or perhaps more accurately an ideal that many strive to. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of free time within a 7-day week, divided between 5 days of work and 2 days of leisure. This rather Western and Christian allocation of time is the rhythm of our lives. Of course, the reality of this free time is not that it is that one is really able to entirely dedicate it to one's own being, to social relations, to idleness, to culture, as one would want. But it is usually dominated by domestic work and other forms of exploitation. But perhaps this is another story. This slide that you're looking at is actually of an installation I made in 2019 at the Albertinum in Dresden, which consists of a series of seatings for the museum scattered around the collection, the permanent collection. So for this talk, I'm following a line of thought that mirrors the history of work to the history of leisure, as somehow it's necessarily negative or opposite. It is really heavily influenced by a text that we have been reading today with the campus by Sergio Bologna, called Freizeitkultur, that comes from the catalogue of Andreas Foregarassi's contribution to the Venice Biennial in 2008, I think. I'm looking at this specific conundrum, the negative, positive, work, leisure, free time, occupied time, or free time, work time, from a situation that, of course, by working in culture, I actually work and specifically inhabit, we specifically inhabit actually with our labor and our institution, the time space of society's leisure. I do know, and I'm very aware of the fact that I make work for parents and children at weekends or on holidays. Okay, this is photographic notes from 1959 by Hans Haacke. It might count in many ways as Hans Haacke's first work. It's a series of 26 black and white photographs that he took while he was a student in Kassel, in the place where the Documenta exhibition takes place. And his summer job, so while there were no classes, was to be an exhibition attendant, a gallery attendant. Was perhaps one of the largest contemporary art exhibitions of the time, one of the most important ones today. The photographs record one of the most important kind of confrontations between the general public and the sort of contemporary art, very much an American contemporary art. Presented there, including works by Mondrian and Pollock and Kandinsky, presented in Germany for perhaps the first time. However, what the photographs record is really not the art. It's really clear he's not looking at the art. He's actually looking at how people inhabit exhibition spaces. What is, what this encounter feels like and looks like with people, to people, with people. So it's somehow an encounter, a social space in which art is one of the many things present, not the main thing. In this way, Hans Haacke actually already outlines a concern that would be present throughout his career, even though he's so young and he hasn't even finished studying yet. You can already see that by just shifting focus, he's actually able to uncover a whole way of looking at the world, which I think will continue to today. I mean, he's still working today. It's really strange to see these photographs today. I mean, in many ways, perhaps the public is not that different. In many ways, it really is, especially the photograph on the top left corner of somebody. I mean, I still don't know if he's resting his head on the painting or if he's banging his head on the painting, but it's an incredible intimacy to have with an artwork that I think would not be possible to see today. This is just a zoom onto one of these images. That's why it's out of focus. The museum bench, which is something that I'm really interested in. This piece of furniture that shares space with artworks, always has shared spaces with artworks, and yet is not considered a work as such, even though, of course, it is made by someone as well. So that museum benches and museum furniture in many ways shares the history of art with artworks, but within a different category. The museum bench, of course, has a life that's quite parallel to the park bench. Furniture for public spaces that started appearing about the same time since the 18th century in the spaces of leisure and health. Right. Again, this is going back to the deck chair. Free time. So again, a time freed from work once the 8-hour work was obtained was encouraged for the education and the edification of the mind and body, enjoying the benefits of fresh air in the park and enjoying learning a certain form of education within the museum, as the museum became a space to take a stroll on rainy days, which it still is today. The museum bench at the time, however, those large ottomans that would offer comfort and warmth, which is definitely not the case for this bench or the benches that populate contemporary art museums. Of course, historically, it performs many other functions, not just providing a place of repose or a place of rest, but also a platform for viewing others, for flirting, talking, perhaps resting. So this is now a series of images of the rest of the museum benches that consist or that constitute the installation of the Albertinum that I started showing you earlier. The project was called Astelun Liga. It is in part a permanent installation at the Albertinum Museum in Dresden. And part of the work was to try and uncover the history of sitting in the museum by trying to find the surviving museum benches from its history. Of course, there's not that many left. Restoring them and reupholstering them with a fabric of my design, and then scattering them through the museum, but in a completely different capacity, because of course they now have changed category from objects in the museum to objects in the museum collection, and yet are still available for people to sit on and look at art from. I mean, the art apparatus views the spectator as hardly a body at all, but more usually an eye, just a disembodied eye, associated with mind and imagination and vision. It is rarely, a physical, complete conception of the body with needs such as the need to sit down, the need for comfort, or the need for warmth. And also, of course, limitation. In some ways, attending to the museum bench, for me, is also to try and restitute the body of the audience, to give it space and allow it back into the spaces of the museum. This particular room in the permanent collection of the Albertinum contains mostly paintings by a painter called Ferdinand von Breisky, which are all hung at children's height, meaning much, much lower than the usual hanging. The white ball painting is actually a copy after Reisky by Richard Hoffman in 1917, so I used obviously the lowest bench for this, but sitting and what is children's height is very, very similar. It completely changes the way that you perceive art. And yet, of course, flirting, playing, eating, drinking, talking, laughing, and napping, all activities that are still suitable for the public park, were already frowned upon and even explicitly forbidden in the public museum by the end of the 19th century. Western history, as we know, is one of ocularcentrism, in which vision and vision alone, disassociated from a material body, serves as the privileged signifier of rationality. The rational man we inherited from modernism is always represented standing and alone. Okay, 6. Here, 2 photographs of two installations made for the Guangzhou Biennial in 2016, which I would call the sort of infrastructural works that I make, that I'm interested in. I mean, of course, we know that exhibiting, putting work outside, that's what exhibiting is, right? To expose, to show, and to demonstrate. Implicit in any notion of exhibition is that somebody needs to be there. If there isn't an audience, if there isn't a public, at least potentially, then somehow the work doesn't exist, but also it's not just the public that is visiting the exhibition. There's also the people who are exposing, who are working, constructing that reality, informing, who might be only physically present through their labor, but they are still there. Means that I think it's first and foremost that public aspect that characterizes exhibitions, their capacity to qualify space as public. This is what I really understand as working with exhibition making, is that you're making things public. This is what my responsibility somehow is, even if it might be only temporarily so. It might not be within an actual public space, not legally public. However, it needs to be open and available, so that there is an encounter between something being exposed and whoever is exposing it, those being exposed to it as well. This is the sense in which public is meant here. The knowledge associated with what is exhibited immediately enters the public domain, which means it can be used and worked upon and added to. So to put outside. And now my historical references again. So the exhibition in the way that we understand it today, so as a large, as things arranged in a temporary public display, it doesn't have to be large, but usually bigger than a bedroom, not necessarily. It's actually a modern form of mass communication that was developed in the second half of the 19th century. It's really not that old. It's an experiential format that is able to reach large audiences. Exhibitions were, of course, developed as sites of discovery and learning, distribution of knowledge, distribution of ideology, of information, in which political and ideological agendas were articulated through the seduction, the fascination, the sort of spectacle, right, for large audiences. Exhibitions in general have been and still are today, I believe, one of the primary sites for experimentations with mass communication. However, their format is much more flexible and open than what we see in this image, right? But if one talks about exhibition, one of the exhibitions that is commonly cited as a genealogy, like somehow the ancestor of exhibitions, this is one of them. The Great Exhibition of the Work of Industry of All Nations, organized by Prince Albert in 1851 in London. It was to make, so quote, it was to make clear to the world that Great Britain's role as industrial leader. So the aims of that are really rather clear. While looking and researching for this talk and reading and trying to rethink my whole exhibition format from a time in which I cannot go to or make exhibitions, I found this text in a book by Adrian Rifkin, edited by Adrian Rifkin, called Voices of the People, the Politics and Life of La Sociale at the End of the Second Empire, in which there is a translation of a text by Rancière called Going to the Expo, The Worker, His Wife and Machines, Jacques Rancière. There's one particular fragment that really stuck with me that I'd like to read. The Universal Exhibition of 1867, this is the Paris one, of which this is an image of. The employers invite the trade delegates to marvel at a spectacle of machinery. It is like a stage on which magic is mechanized to offer the image of a power made miraculous by the spell of a steam engine. Henceforth, it would be possible to make quality products cheaply and quickly and effortlessly. As a stonemason's delegate remarked, the employer's wish to bewitch the workers was not without malice. They contrasted the spectacle of the machines with the permanent exhibition of moral and material poverty of the workers. And he continues, this is the plan of the exhibition as I found it. Now, I don't know if you can read it. It depends how big your screen is. But the very central, almost the central gallery is the Museum of the History of Work. And just next to it, so it's outlined by or wrapped by the galleries of the history of art. So art wraps work. The center is work, and around it is art. And he continues, capitalism was celebrating the exhibition of its machines against the dramatic background of a working class defeat. The mystery and magic of technical progress was revealed as a bag of mechanical tricks which the employers were using in order to introduce new forms of subservience. Consequently, it was a spectacle of dispossession. The machines, capital's new avatar, belonged to the employers. By intensifying the division of labor, mechanization of production was eliminating the need for skills, and workers were becoming increasingly deprived of the practical means of exercising their right of access to the product of their own labor. What I think is quite shocking about this quote is how kind of current it is. But after refining this piece of text, I really wondered two things. The first thing, because I'm interested in such things, was, okay, so is there another history of exhibitions that I can start thinking about as a genealogy of what I mean by exhibiting, of what my peers and I are trying to do with this putting outside, with the idea of making things public? What is this parallel history that could be written that I would prefer to refer to, one that would be a genealogy that is not one of dispossession, but of the culture, of public culture? Okay, so for something completely different. So, you know, as I said at the beginning, I'm really, whoops. Okay, so I don't know, that was on automatic. I'm really trying to, I'm looking at my work again or differently somehow through the lens of some of this material. So this is a project with somehow my slides are on auto, so they're going a bit faster than I anticipated. A project called Bao Bao, which was at GFZK, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Leipzig. It started in 2014. The exhibition was a cafe, the museum cafe, in which every part of the cafe, the benches, the table, the cups and bowls, the lighting, the walls, were somehow artworks proposed with a simple idea that what if every artwork is somehow functional, meaning it has a role, something to be sat on, something to be used as a table, and altogether it is an exhibition. Of course, I've made all of it, but it can't just be used as a cafe. So you could just completely ignore the fact that it is an artwork. The project was developed in very close relationship to a graphic designer and dear friend and colleague called James Langdon, who also designed the book that you saw at the beginning and edited the book. He proposed an idea. This project started as a fiction in the book by James Langdon of the School of Design Fiction, rethinking what a school of design fiction could be today. And I described in a chapter of the book the refectory of such a school, which eventually came to be as Café Bao Bao. Let's see if this works. This was the sign. Bao Bao. Why Bao Bao? So Bao Bao is, in Italian, is the sound of a dog. It's woof woof. The building was called Neubau, so a new building. It's a play with the fact that Bao is actually construction. So the construction on the construction, and a dog barking at the moon. Whoops. Let's see if this works. Oops. Okay. So back to my question, my alternative exhibition history, or maybe not alternative, just another exhibition history. That wouldn't just be going through the salons and the great exhibitions and other spectacles of dispossession. I was wondering if this genealogy, I was wondering what it would look like. And I was wondering if it would include things like workers' clubs, institutions of leisure dedicated to the culture of working people. I mean, the workers' club are really famous as a paradigm, partly to do with the architecture of some of the most famous ones. Here's one, the Rysakov Workers' Club by architect Konstantin Melnikov. But in the Soviet Union, the workers' clubs really spread like wildfire after the October Revolution. So in the 20s and 30s, it's only, I think, as far as I understand, in the late 20s that the first workers' club were built specifically as new buildings. They would be occupying existing buildings before. So the headquarters, these were supposed to be headquarters buildings where workers spent their free time. They were designed, some by great architects of the time, great architects of the constructivist school. Some were just adapted buildings like theaters or churches. So workers' clubs embodied the notion of proletarian culture, right, as housed in the host of prolet cult, which, as far as I understand from the Russian, is a made-up name from proletarian and culture, which made-up word, made, of course, very much towards anti-religious propaganda and agitation, and something that's called self-action. So amateur performances as well as spectacle like music or theater would be happening in these places. By 1920, there was already a federation of over 200 independent organizations, and it had 500,000 participants, which seems really huge. Like many other original revolutionary institutions, it was completely shut down in 1932, even though there's still hundreds of workers' clubs that exist. And they provide also very simple things like a laundry room, etc. I found this little drawing. These two images come from a text by a lady called Anna Bokov from 2017 called Soviet Workers' Clubs, Lessons from the Social Condensers, from the Journal of Architecture. So the basic workers' club program contains the following elements: a foyer with a cloakroom, auditorium, quiet recreation room, library and reading room. Other sections: classrooms, administration, children's playroom, occupiable roof, so a roof that you could occupy, I guess, and an exterior terrace. As is really apparent from the program, the club would need to have spaces for personal activities, like reflection and quiet play, as well as spaces for collective activities. And I think it's really interesting to also look at the relationship between inside and outside, between the street, where people also are somehow congregating, and the rooms of this large public house. Perhaps the most famous workers' club was, of course, not actually a working club, meaning it was designed as an exhibition. So we're going back to the great exhibitions. This is the Lenin Workers' Club by Alexander Rodchenko. It was designed in 1925 for the Paris International Exhibition of Decorative Arts and Modern Industry. The scale reconstruction traveled to Tate Modern in 2009, which is where I saw it, and is currently at the State Tretyakov Museum in Russia. But the 1925 exhibition was, of course, a great opportunity for Soviet Russia to distribute its cultural achievements on an international stage, present its cultural achievements, and it, of course, included many other things except the workers' club, like Popov's textiles. The designs for this collective leisure space were very specific in terms of the items in it. Display cases for photographs, documents, and maps, pull-out projection screens, this reading desk that could be adjustable, as well as these very specifically designed chairs. There's also a Lenin corner, which you can't see. No, you can't see, but it's like somehow behind it. Here's what Rodchenko said about the club, rather, I think a quote that has been published many times. He says, "The light is from the East, not only the liberation of the working class, the light is from the East in a new relation to man, to woman, and to objects. Objects in our hands should also be equal, also be comrades, and not gloomy slaves like they have been here. The art of the East should be nationalized and rationed out. Objects will be understood, will become people's friends and comrades, and people will begin to know how to laugh and enjoy and converse with things." This is an installation I made in 2016, or an artwork as a container. It is called All Our Tomorrows, and was made specifically for, commissioned by and made specifically for Luma Foundation to host a conference on the future of institutions called How Institutions Think, mostly organized by Paul O'Neill. So going back to that Rancière quote, you know, the idea of dispossession, the idea of the exhibition as a spectacle of dispossession, you know, there's also another question that I think this raises that is particularly important to me, important to people who work in culture, I think. It's a question that was actually asked to me by the really brilliant Andrea Phillips. What would the equivalent form of dispossession take place today? You know, the dispossession that he's talking about, this kind of spectacle, that Rancière is talking about, the spectacle of dispossession, and when trades, representative of the trades, are going to see the machines that will strip them of their jobs. What happens when I go and see an exhibition in a large, world-famous museum, for example? What type of removal of dispossession is taking place there? I'm sure there's lots of things to say here. You know, for example, the experience, of course, reinforces hierarchies of taste and taste mechanisms in terms of what is valued and what is not valued, what is recognized as culture, what is recognized as art, what is recognized as work, and what is not. And there's, of course, a certain level of economic expropriation, because I know as an artist that, you know, the exhibition was in part financed by a really powerful gallery, perhaps a financial contribution from an estate, and it does effectively take the work further away from me in some ways, further away from the cultural worker in the room, as well as other forms of labor which should have been involved but are not. You know, who made the wall, who painted the wall, who wrote the captions, how is this being interpreted, what is all the work that is being deleted by the exhibition, by the artwork, in the way that I am able to encounter it. What are the conditions in which I can actually encounter it? But at the same time, somehow that very experience does make me a worker. You know, I am working when I'm going to see exhibitions in some ways, against everything that I've been taught, which was to distance myself from that kind of worker-machine relation that Rancière was talking about. Ultimately, the problem I recognize is that experiencing art in an exhibition context is almost never a communal experience, almost never a collective experience. It does not form a community. This is not what it is designed for. It is designed to have private experiences. This is not the reason why, but perhaps one of the reasons why I work in the way that I do. So this is a photograph of the curtain in use, effectively. So launched in the world for the purpose that it was designed for. Of course, it's an artwork, but it's also a container for a particular kind of activity and a particular kind of discussion. I'm actually in this picture, funnily enough, or not funnily enough, because of course I attended the conference. It was really interesting. So All Our Tomorrows is both an installation and somehow a framework for discussing institutions. It was installed as a model. What the curtain actually is in terms of its shape. I don't know if I've got another picture of it. Yeah. So here, of course, it's a framing mechanism, but those big shapes, the windows for the curtain that they were used to frame what was inside and outside the conference, it's literally a one-to-one drawing of a really beautiful and amazing building designed by Lina Bobardi. It's the top floor of Cesc Pompeia, which is a kind of leisure activity place, which I will talk about in a bit. And this is a one-to-one drawing of the top floor of that with the windows. This is what Cesc Pompeia looks like. It's not the floor that I drew. This is the ground floor. It's one of the large assembly halls that has a lake in it. This is a photograph, I think, from the late 80s, and one of the sketches on the left from the sport block. Cesc Pompeia is kind of an association. The Cescs I actually don't even know how to translate it, but there are architectural complexes that are all over Brazilian cities with facilities for leisure, education and culture, including sports. They're open for the local population, but they're funded by the local businesses. So they're non-governmental organizations. So somehow workers' associations in some ways. They're created in the 40s to provide people who work with health services and sporting and cultural activities. In the case of Pompeii, I mean, of course, this isn't just an amazing, something that was available for the area. This building became really famous and became an example of something that's dubbed as a democratic architecture, meaning also a democratic sense of what culture is that could be entered at any levels. So they are incredibly radical exhibitions that are presented next to tables where people can play chess, that are next to a sport complex, which is, contains also a beach where you can just go and get a time. I'm seeking out the communal experience here, right? And of course, the communal experience, as described as a cultural experience. I don't know, this is my computer doing its own thing again. In some ways, to me, is much more like perhaps a concert, like listening to music is more communal. You have a sense of sharing an aesthetic experience with people when you go and see a concert or theater or a performance, things on stage, a talk perhaps, is that. So here you've just seen different images of John Tilbury perform in and with some of my exhibitions. I've been working with John Tilbury for a number of years. He's mostly known for being an outstanding interpreter, an amazing pianist, and interpreter of contemporary piano pieces, like Morton Feldman, perhaps most famously. He was also a member of the British improv group called AMM since 1979 with Keith Rowe and Eddie Provost, for which he joined other improvisers to create and refine radically unique approaches to collective invention. That's really his thing. He also worked with and then eventually wrote the amazing biography of Cornelius Cardew. It's called A Life Unfinished. It was published in 2008. He said he spent 12 years writing it. It's a really amazing person. One of the main reasons why I started working with John is that his notion of what the instrument is incredibly interesting, and to me allowed me to re-understand my work as somebody who makes sculptures, and to make sculptures as instruments was something that I could do with him. So I started making sculptures for him, sculptures for him to play with, because his sense of the expanded instrument is so inspiring. So this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. the video is online, it's on Vimeo. I mean, the reason for showing you this is except the fact that I wonder if this is more of a communal experience. I'm fascinated by the capacity of someone like John, but perhaps, you know, many other people too, to work with other people's work, so that something always becomes an instrument to make something else with. And I really mean this as a work in a, you know, in the sense of an artist and a pianist, or different people working on top of each other, and that everything that is produced in that way has these simultaneous other lives that can just be added on in a cumulative way. I mean, of course, you know, the kind of experience that this offers is a very different one to, you know, what normally seeing exhibitions is, so that people are listening, which I particularly enjoy. Okay, let's see if now this slide is stuck. Anyway, next image. Whoops, I think my computer's playing up. Next image, another historical reference. This was actually an architectural proposal for the Louvre. It is a painting by Giuseppe Castiglione of 1861. The Louvre in Paris, as I'm sure many of you know, was supposed to be a museum for the private collection of the king, but the French Revolution got in the way, and it actually opened as the palace. Hang on, there's a really nice. It was called the Monument Dedicated to Love and Study of the Arts Belonging to the Common Man and Woman of the New Republic. So in the new revolutionary calendar, there was actually a 10-day week rather than a 7-day week, which was perceived to be Christian, which it is. So within that 10-day week, the museum had 5 days reserved for artists and copyists, 3 for the general public, 2 for cleaning and maintenance. Becoming public meant that the museum needed to be available as a resource to work with for artists. So it was also a residency. Artists were allowed to live there. If the museum is a place where artworks should be displayed, then obviously artists should be able to live there. That's one way of supporting the production of culture somehow, which I quite like as an idea. It's like a time of museum utopia. Of course, we can imagine that those days were very chaotic. Apparently, there were spaces filled to the brim with objects and people living there, as well as large crowds visiting on the public days. They engaged in activities of everyday life. Of course, you were allowed to sleep, to eat, to have picnics. Drinking and resting were allowed. Prostitution was also allowed. And other trades were present throughout, like public squares. These days did not last. Of course, the museum was closed within 5 years, and then it reopened in 1796 on the 14th of July, of course. The galleries were lit, the prostitutes were kicked out, and all the artworks were arranged in what is now known Galleria Progressiva, meaning starting from the past and going towards the present. So again, in my attempts at the genealogy, I thought about Toynbee Hall. Toynbee Hall was created in 1884 by Samuel and Henrietta Bonnet. It's a place for future leaders, and here read Cambridge and Oxford educated students to come and live in the East End in Whitechapel and learn about work as volunteers and learn about the context of poverty in order to, when they became leaders, important people, fight poverty, understand it, and try and eliminate it somehow. I think Toynbee Hall also inspired Hull House in Chicago, which was founded by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, opened in 1889. So this is really very much in the middle of the settlement movement, but Hull House was available to European immigrants who just arrived in the US. Jane Addams called on women, especially middle-class women with leisure time and energy, as well as rich philanthropism, to exercise their civic duty to become involved in municipal affairs as a matter of civic housekeeping. So here I'm going back to this idea of what's happening in the space of leisure and how much of that free time is private or public time that is made available to the public. I've had a really long interest and engagement with the spaces and furniture of public spaces, of spaces where people can be outside their home. And this is again on like some kind of weird timer, which is a reason why, this is just going to go to the end of my presentation, I know, but this is one of the reasons why I've been looking at the kind of furniture that populate, of course, museums, but also parks. And one of the parallel histories of that furniture is the history of, let's see if I can go back. Yes. The history of plants in exhibitions, which, you know, as part of the things that are unnamed, I mean, it wouldn't be now really, really strange to actually see plants decorating an exhibition. However, there's quite a long history of that. House plants, like most of the museum's apparatus of visibility, don't appear in the history of art, and yet they were really present there until the 80s, 70s, actually 70s and 80s. All of the photographs in these images are photographs from the MoMA archive. The simple reason why I looked at MoMA is because the archive is online, so it's actually available. It was really interesting to me that between the 30s and the 80s, there's just plants all over the place, somehow decorating or making space habitable. This is what I figured out, you know, that in terms of creating an interior in which when you enter, the exhibition is not so intimidating. There's someone there before you, in the same way that there would be a plant in a living room. This one is particularly funny, I think. The Alocasia sanderiana decorating the Rothko exhibition. So these were all pages from a little artist book which traces, which I made called Zanzibar, which traces a series of artworks around the relationship to plants and gardens and with exhibitions. And here I'm back to Lina Bobardi. My number 18 is a poster or a drawing, perhaps, gathering different material, both about Cesc Pompeii and a different project that she made called the MASPI, the Museum of Contemporary Art of Sao Paulo. And then that statement, which has stayed with me, she really thought that the responsibility of the museum was threefold. That museum should, of course, contain a collection to show the art of the past, popular art, and by popular art she actually means arte popolare, which is crafts, the art made by people, not just what is popular, as well as a playground. And in that way, she's placing the responsibility of the museum within something that would be including different ways of encountering culture, again, at all levels, without a hierarchy between them. She made one building which has fascinated me for a long time and that I used for the Zanzibar series of projects. I wish I could go back again. Oops, here it is. Oh, sorry about this. It was a building of somehow like a small cultural center, an association, a restaurant. Yeah, I wish I could stop it. Called at some point Coti, in Ladeira da Misericordia in the north of Brazil. The structure in the middle is a stage on which bands would play, and they would actually be a restaurant. This is the building that I used to develop the project, thinking that the history of plants could be put in relationship to one building. I'm sure there are others, but one building that was entirely designed around a single plant. Here, actually being a mango tree that grows in the middle. So it was entirely cast in concrete in situ, because that was the one way of building on a difficult site and including this plant. Okay, and then my slides have gone a little bit berserk, but anyway. So, which brings me to the garden somehow. I was really thinking about gardens as, again, like a different kind of communal experience. Of course, gardens are also exhibitions, no? Like we know that any kind of botanical garden is somehow an exhibition of things that might have been collected, you know, very colonial in the UK. Kew Gardens, for example, is completely intertwined in the history of colonialism. But there's also different kinds of gardens and garden shows. This is an image from an East End flower show, as recorded in a magazine called The Day of Rest of 1873, held in a local church hall, of course the day of rest being Sunday, the holy day, the day of leisure. And perhaps this is actually quite a good time to mention the context in which I'm actually giving this talk. I hope I haven't completely run over time. I mean, the way that we're being separated means that we're spending our lives on screen, on interfaces, right? That while we're using them, I'm mining all the data that they can, and capitalizing on it, with or against our will. While our daily needs and services are being delivered by people who are more vulnerable than me, right? That somehow work for those big corporations. Like at the moment, it's all Amazon and Google. Apparently, even the vaccines and tests are going to be delivered by them. All these forms of labor are incredibly vulnerable, and the people who are profiting the most are the ones who think that their only weakness is the fact that they don't just have robots all over the place, right? So, I mean, I don't know if this is a glimpse of the world that Amazon wants us to have, but I think it's really grim. I really do not like it, and I somehow think I need to absorb it in relationship to thinking of distance learning and delivering things over these platforms is not the way that we want to live. I'm pretty sure that most people would agree with me. We do not want all our relations and activities to be surveyed and mineable. We do not want to have our private lives, private conversations in profit centers, and we also do not want to engage in culture only in this private way. The idea of a public platform is absolutely essential. And I wonder how, but if this is an opportunity to refuse the kind of life. So that was my sort of Naomi Klein moment. I'm going back to the production of that amazing building by Lina Bobardi, which for me was, looking at how that was made was a way of producing a whole series of artworks and sculptures that resulted into different things, looking at this relationship between plants and exhibitions, between gardens and exhibitions, and whether exhibitions could be treated as, or could be work as outdoor gardens. Because you're still going through the book, and an installation, here's the Pavilion, which is now a permanent exhibit. It's a sculpture garden at IMA in Brisbane in Australia, as well as here are some images of the building site of it. The negative of this formed a public artwork, which is now in King's Cross, on the ground floor of one of the buildings behind St. Martin's, as well as some of the sculptures like the freestanding screen, which are more material tests and exhibition pieces, but still allowed me to construct this. This is the King's Cross one, artworks like this one. This of course exists as a model. The reason why I've got these here is that I also think that any kind of constructed reality, any kind of structure, of course acts as a model for a type of place, a type of society, a type of inhabitation that one would like to live with or live in. And I really am interested in that relationship between the model as a social model and the model, of course, as a reduced version of reality. One last parenthesis about the place of work. I've said quite a lot about museums and galleries, but of course, the place of work in relationship to people who are looking at this for an artist in general would often be the artist studio. Of course, I have, or not of course, I actually happen to have a studio. It was interesting to me at the moment that my artist studio and I fall outside all of the government schemes supposed to help in this moment. And my artist studio as a place of work is not, however, considered to be, like, for example, we cannot be exempt from business rates because we, as an artist studio, it is neither hospitality nor entertainment, which makes me wonder again where the artist's workplace is in relationship to the society, and therefore what artist's position in relationship to society might be. with this slightly gloomy note. I think I've come to the end of my talk. It's 7:30. I wonder if, oh, I don't know. I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to do now. Maybe share, stop share. Stop share? Stop sharing my screen.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Céline. And while I work out how we process things, I'll come back as well via video.
So one thing, of course, is that I'm really happy to have questions. I'm sorry this was kind of a bit fragmented, but I hope that you found something to follow through it, and I'll be very interested in hearing any questions you may have.
Yeah, so I'm able to see the live chat now. So, but before any questions have come through, I just kind of want to touch again upon what you were saying at the initial stages about making work for parents and children at weekends, and what you're talking about in terms of Hans Haacke being an invigilator in Kassel and things like that. And it got me to thinking about how we inhabit exhibition spaces and how we can make our engagement with contemporary art compelling right now, because obviously, you know, there are no exhibitions possible. And if exhibition space is public and we have no exhibition space, what is that new public? So I think from
questions I'm really grappling with.
Yeah.
You know, what is, I've made literally my entire career has been made in relationship to audience and public. So what is this going to be? What is this right now, and how to engage with it?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. One of the campus cohort, Raoul, asks about your analysis of benches and chairs, and whether or not you could perhaps use that to reflect upon the meanings of beds at home and in hospital in our current context, something that we're seeing all the time on the news and through personal experience, of course.
Because beds are incredibly private, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's always been interesting to me how so sleeping in public is really frowned upon, except in transport, right? On trains and on planes when you're going elsewhere. It's not exactly beds, but they're kind of like more similar to beds. But in Southern Europe, which is where I come from, people sleep in the afternoon in public all the time, at the beach, in the park, and any little piece of shade will have someone resting for a little bit. And this idea of sleeping as a private activity is actually not that old, apparently. People used to sleep with much looser arrangements and groups of people. The bed was not necessarily, apparently. I mean, I've weirdly enough, I've actually read quite a lot about the history of sleep because I'm a total insomniac. So I'm really obsessed with sleep, like all insomniacs. And apparently beds within a family structure, but not so long ago, until 100 years ago, were actually the place where conversations would take place. So you wouldn't go to sleep and sleep all night and wake up in the morning. You would go to sleep for a few hours, wake up, and there would be a midnight feast, meaning in the middle of the night there would be a break, and that's when the family got together and discussed problems and etc. Right? And then everybody would go back to sleep and sleep for 4 hours. And then I really love thinking about beds like that, as this.
I think it's really interesting as well in terms of how we think about work today, right? Because what you're talking about, that interval within the sleep, there is a name for it. I can't remember historically what it's called, was necessary because all work was only possible in daylight, and the only opportunity there was to socialize or maybe do your courting or sort out problems and difficulties was this small space at kind of 3 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Whilst we're talking about beds, it made me think, I've seen lots of photographs of the new Nightingale Hospital, the NHS hospital, as it was being built through the media. And the thing it made me think of, kind of in terms of furniture and structure and the aesthetics of it, it looked like an art fair. The booths, the kind of empty spaces, and the kind of the way we read the furniture, and how when we are ill, we think in units. we think in compartmentalized space. And yeah, it just brings to home how human life is being compartmentalized at the moment, I think.
I saw photographs of the one new hospital that was built in Madrid, and it was made in the space that Arco Madrid, so the art fair, had taken place in just 2 weeks beforehand. It just took 2 weeks between the space being an art fair. It was crowded, obviously, and it being a hospital. It's incredible how close those realities are, no? In a way that, of course, I never thought about. I really never thought about before. So that extreme fragmentation is actually more, I don't know, I don't know if it's more flexible, but it's definitely enclosing.
Sure.
More than more.
We have some more questions coming through. So Milika is asking, activation is often courted by your practice. Therefore, which moment do you claim this as part of your own cultural capital? And how much does time, in inverted commas, become a part of that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I have obviously thought and kind of asked questions about that for quite a long time. It's the boundaries between what is mine and what is not mine are not as clear as they are for a lot of artists. I really embrace that and really enjoy that in one way because of the relationship to the public or an audience, or what Millie calls activation, of course, but in another way also because my work often includes the work of others. So the stratification of work, like for example in the case of the concert with John Tilbury, it's like, I don't have a problem with reading that. It's obvious, it's his concert, he's using my stool as an instrument. Like those authorships overlap in a way that is really comfortable for me. Mm-hmm. However, it is sometimes complicated to explain or understand, especially in the context of an art world, an art community in which that separation and being able to recognize what one person has done by themselves is extremely important. But this is not just in the art world, right? Like academic work also relies on that. The idea when you do a PhD, when you do an essay, you have to prove that what you're saying is your voices alone, and the voices of others have to be relegated to the footnotes. They have to be written really small or at the end of the essay. So this, this idea of people working on their own and everything being their voice is incredibly dominant in a way that I just don't care. I don't care about. So having said this, there's something often it is really terrifying when I've been working on something like the Guangzhou Biennial works. I work on something for ages. I get it made or order the materials, work with people to kind of get it built in, and then it opens and there's like 40 people climbing all over it, and it's like horrific. I always think it's gonna fall down, it's gonna get destroyed. Yeah. People are going to demolish it, somebody will die, whatever. Like worst case scenario, usually I leave. But then that's the point of the work, that once it's public, it's public. Of course it's my work, but it can be inhabited in a million other ways by people who don't know I exist. And that is great.
It reminds me a few years ago, do you remember there was a big stink in the British press about someone who'd let their kid climb onto a Donald Judd because it happened to look like a bunk bed. And of course, it looks really fun. It looks like how climbing equipment is aping the shapes of modern contemporary sculpture. So yeah, of course the kid's going to climb on it. That brings us quite neatly to a question from Kevin Hunt, who identifies it must be feeling quite strange for you at the moment to reflect on the social purpose of your works. Mm-hmm. And he asks if you've had any time or headspace to consider how those existing works can remain social, or perhaps new works could become social in different ways.
Yeah, of course, really good and really difficult question for me. social distancing, like the 2-meter distance when you're sitting on a bench. So you can't sit on it, obviously. Museums are apparently the Albertinum, the museum with the deck chair and all the benches, is reopening. I think in 10 days. Amazing.
Yeah.
But how can you see exhibitions? How can we imagine seeing exhibitions with social distancing? Like so much of my work has to do with this putting outside, public space with, benches with, lines across them so that you can't sit on them. This is literally, my entire interest. I'm working at the moment on a playground. I'm developing a playground with South London Gallery and Southwark Council. Playgrounds have been closed for 7 weeks. Maybe kids are not going to play on playgrounds for a long time. Who knows? Look, I'm not a medium. I don't know what's happening. I think, the reason why I talked about the extreme separation and fragmentation that is given by the screens and the fact that we're made to believe that this is the way that things have to continue, is that I do think there is some space, and there must be some space at some point to refuse it. It's really difficult to think of being a collective or thinking together. It's really difficult to being together when we're all behind our screens. It's not impossible, but it is really, really difficult. And I think there must be some ways that we can refuse at least some of the reality that's being given to us, that's being sold to us as the only possibility. I mean, we know this from the way that universities have gone, for example, right? There isn't just one way. It's not that privatization and itemization and modularization had to win everything. There are some spaces that are outside of that can still be inhabited. And my livelihood completely depends on that. Having said this, I'm looking for a teaching job, because that might be the only thing I can do.
But I think there are still common experiences that everyone can relate to in this time. So I think where Kevin was sort of coming from with that question, perhaps it might be a good point now to explain the thinking behind support structures and what that, maybe not give any answers about what that might mean right now, because that puts a terrible amount of pressure on you. And we know you're not some kind of oracle in this scenario, but how would a support structure help you identify perhaps what some of those problems are, do you think?
Well, the whole thinking around support structures was always in relationship to particular groups of people. So in a way, I would say as an answer that answer can only be specific. It cannot be general. A support structure for the campus community, for example, which would be very much a way, finding ways of thinking and being together, of finding a sense of community and dialogue sustained through geographical and physical distance, because it's a group that's always been physically distant in some way, like a support structure that specifically deals with that, and in which perhaps technology has a role, I think could be an answer, but just as in relationship to that situation. I don't think there is a universal solution, and I don't think there is for me one possibility. I think actually working on totally different ways to answer that question might be the only way that I can do it. And teaching and public speaking and writing, as well as making artworks, as well as, I don't know, publishing books might be the solution, like continuing to work on all these different platforms that talk with different people and different audiences at any given time.
But of course, one of the campus cohort has just has come into the chat saying, of course, online space is a public space. And we've discussed today in our seminar sessions how sometimes being in a Zoom all day long is an invasive process, and we lose some of our liberties in that sense. So how might we use that online space to be public in a positive way?
Well, I mean, we know that as an online space, it has been used to organize, right? Very much, in Egypt, the Arab Spring, in Istanbul, we know that it is used like this. the spatial configuration of it is a problem because it's not actually spatial. I'm really good with space. I'm not that good with online space. You know, they are very, very different things because the body is absent, and that makes it an extremely abstracted space, right? Which I think is really difficult to get your head around when you're, you know, not for everybody, you know, but when you're somebody whose job it is to make objects and put them into the world, it's really hard to get your head around what kind of space it is. It is obviously social and it can be political. However, it's only public in the sense that it is accessible by many, right? Because all of the stuff that we're using is completely private and extremely expensive. I mean, you know, Zoom is free, but it's got terrible security issues. You know, like we all know this stuff, right? So, you know, the limits of the platforms that we use are extremely tangible once you reach those limits, right? Before that, it looks like it's for everything. Nobody's interested in my conversation. But if suddenly I'm an organizer in, you know, like Gezi in Istanbul, suddenly when you reach those walls, it really shuts down. You know, like there are many countries where there are platforms like YouTube that are not accessible, or WhatsApp or Skype or whatever. So yeah, up to a certain point, I do think we have to be really suspicious of these platforms as well. I mean, in the same way that space is a control mechanism, right? Buildings are also control mechanisms.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to take a slightly different tack now, I was just wondering if you had some thoughts when you were talking about the arte popolare and the crafts being the art of the people as a kind of non-hierarchical take of artistic production. I think it's quite interesting, as we're in lockdown, so many people, the things that they are sharing publicly are the things that they're making at home in a domestic setting. So, you know, showing their sourdough, their embroidery, that's mainly what my social media feeds are full of right now. So maybe this is a way of connecting with each other. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's true, making things together.
Yeah.
Now, even while being apart. I mean, I'm not one of those people. I can't do anything. I don't have any time. I have a small child. I have much less time than I had before. Boredom has not entered my experience of lockdown, but I realize that this is really specific to people who have small children or children in school age. Because obviously also if you have to school your children, like forget it. You can't even do your job, let alone sourdough.
Yeah. I mean, I think coming back to the questions, Raoul asks us if it's possible to talk about a sound turn in contemporary art, and if so, is it driven by an exhaustion of the visual or the need for a more sort of collective experience in museums, or is it both?
I don't know what it's driven by. I'm interested in the collective experience very much. And I do recognize the failures of artists, I would say, and a lot of contemporary art to actually create that. But I think that's one of the reasons why performance is such a, you know, successful and important format.
Because it's instantly relatable.
And also you enter a space in which other people are experiencing a similar thing. You know, the connection to others makes that time public in a way that very few things are when everything is consumption.
We have a question from Kitty Koch, who asks, coming out of a pandemic, how do you see that we can maintain the importance of public space and social interactions and resist more the aspects of our life going online?
Oh dear, that's a really hard question.
It is rather.
I don't know how, but I really think we have to. You know, like the extreme privatization of space, I think, is what we're seeing now, right? With the confinement. I mean, I actually prefer talking about it as confinement rather than lockdown, because it's not really lockdown. I mean, if you talk to someone who's living in Spain, what we have here is not a lockdown. But that privatization has been happening for a long time, right? The boundaries of what we can do in public space, what public actually means have been retreating, certainly for as long as I've been an adult. Certainly, at least, 30 years, 25 years. I don't know how long I've been an adult. And I think the pandemic is, I really think that we should stay at home, and don't get me wrong. I really think that we have to actually respect this moment. However, I think it is a moment when a lot of things are being eroded that are really important to our societies and to us as individuals for us to continue to function as a community, as communities. So I think it's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah, it's changing how we think about work, isn't it? It's changing how we perceive our leisure time and how we think about what we do at work and where geographically work exists, whether it exists in our head or whether it's something that we have to physically engage with,
Yeah, I think you're right that it has a lot to do with the spaces of work. That's what's changing, and perhaps that's where some resistance can be done. Like the refusal of working all the time is the refusal to work all the time at home, right? At least home time should be in some ways protected. On a slightly more positive note, I thought I would add something about this, that one thing that's really changing is people's understanding of how necessary travel is for work. And thinking of how blue the sky is in London right now, I'm really happy all those businessmen and women are not flying from City Airport or wherever, for the one meeting in Frankfurt. It's possible that will really change, that people can actually function quite well with online spaces for at least, a large part of the meetings that were before deemed completely necessary. And that is, that's definitely taking a step down on everybody's carbon footprint, which is a really wonderful thing to look at right now.
We were talking today in our seminar, though, about how sometimes the commute to and from work is that opportunity to disengage from the stresses of our daily life and to be a point of departure from one thing to another. And at the moment, I think working from home, speaking personally, it's not having that interim time to disengage that becomes so tiring and so kind of emotionally draining, really, because you are at home at work.
Yeah, no separation, right? That's what's exhausting.
Yeah. So we have a question from Sam. Your alternative history of exhibitions feels more orientated towards events, festivals, performances. For example, in workers' clubs, the Luma conference. Dan, those exhibitions. Have you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I've been doing exhibitions for a long time. This is not necessarily like, the consequences are hard to take. However, I remember while working with Sally Talent and Francesca Marcord and Raimundas Malaskauskas in the Liverpool Biennial, at some point realizing that the right way of thinking about it was not as an exhibition, that it was actually a festival for the city. Yeah. And that was a huge breakthrough for me once I realized that was the way that I could work. I was making something for a city festival that was going to be, open for a few months, and it meant opening a whole part of the city, but a whole part of cultural production of Britain to people for a certain time. So, in the sense, it was still the format of an exhibition, of course, but that is what a biennial is. No, it's like a sort of short-term festival somehow. So it's not exactly an answer as such. But
they just recap what happened with your project at the Liverpool Biennial then in that instance.
So I decided that if it was a festival, perhaps one of the ways that I could support, like make a support structure somehow offering to the audience, was to offer different entries into the Liverpool Biennial. And by this, I mean physical as well as metaphorical or intellectual entries, right? Ways to enter the subject, ways to enter the building, ways to enter what it was that people were actually doing. So I made 6 or 7, I think, portals, what I called portals, which were kind of sculptures, but that you could enter into the Liverpool Biennial, including entering the book. Also, the first pages of the book were the portal. So, like facilitating entry, let's say.
I'm not sure I've formulated this question properly in my head, so forgive the waffle in advance here, but can I take you from one biennial to another and ask you about how exhibitions can be treated as gardens? And the biennial I'm obviously thinking of, the most famous and the oldest biennial, which is orientated around a garden in the Giardini, the Venice Biennale. So is it significant that this really historic model of biennial is orientated around an idealized space, a utopic space, a space where we feel as though we are having a quest or an adventure around every corner? And I'm sort of wanting you to touch upon plants and exhibitions as you did in your talk as well. Does that have any bearing, this idealized space? You talked about it being domestic space, but is it perhaps something a bit more?
I think plants in exhibitions are about domestic space somehow, domesticating space, taming it. I do think that there is something about the experience of visiting a garden that is actually very similar to visiting an exhibition, but predates it. It's much, much older, right? And in that sense, it's also much more open, right? People go to visit gardens who are not interested in contemporary art and don't have an art education and whatever, and that's how it should be. I grew up in Italy, and the history of garden design is in Italy very much like exhibitions in open air, right? All gardens would be decorated with statues at the corners, so you would enter, and then after a tree would turn and you would have a vista where there would be a pavilion or a lake. Somehow apparently parks like Hampstead Heath or Hyde Park were also designed like this, with the idea of a choreography in space, right? Sure. That's what it is. So it's not a static thing, it's something that you walk through, and the environment helps you to converse, to think, to relax, to whatever, all sorts of things. Like, it's really highly choreographed. So it is based on an idea of bodies in movement in space, which I also think is a really interesting and really nice way to think about gardens, right? That it's a narrative that is unfolding. And that's what the Giardini is, of course. It's a narrative that unfolds with different people having placed different things on this garden. And then, of course, the contents of the pavilions change from one biennial to the other. But effectively, it's bringing it back to this really, really old form of being in public, which is on the promenade.
Yeah. And I think, you think about gardens as a public space historically, pleasure gardens, and also as a sensory experience as well. And that's kind of very much reflected in going to those pavilions and visiting unusual types of contemporary art, of course. We're approaching 8 o'clock, and I'm aware there's a national sensory experience just about to erupt. So we have no further questions on YouTube. So maybe this is a good time to draw things to a close.
Before the NHS was clapping.
Exactly. So I'd like to say thank you so much, Céline, for a really engaging talk. And thank you on behalf of Campus and Nottingham Contemporary. And hopefully you'll join us in person soon.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.